This fifth talk on world history will deal with the subject of cosmology. And this is probably the most difficult subject to handle. And if we cut to the quick, the reason why is because in the realm of cosmology, there's a very obvious problem to someone who wants to argue for a young Earth. And that is the starlight and time problem. The apparent use of light years to measure distances from stars to the Earth would indicate, using the Hubble spacecraft, or space telescope, that there's about 13 billion years in terms of some of the oldest stars and their light reaching the Earth. And that immediately presents a conundrum. Now, solutions to that conundrum I have read, and they are brain taxing to say the least. I read them by Humphreys and also by John Hartnett. These are very respectable astronomers and who have a lot of knowledge in this subject, and they use ideas based around Einstein's theory of relativity, time dilation, and things of that ilk. I've never been convinced of their ideas, and I'm not sure they are convinced of them now themselves. I think they may have changed. So my general point of this is that when it comes to cosmology, that is the study of the universe, there is so little we really know, and there is so much to know, that it would be unrealistic to come to any definite conclusions. The Big Bang Theory, which is the current model, is itself highly problematic. And there's an interesting article which you can look up on the internet where scientists have argued against the Big Bang Theory's monopoly of grants and professorships and publications in peer-reviewed journals. And these aren't Christians particularly, these are scientists who have, for various reasons, an alternative view of the universe. Some want to have a steady state universe that's eternal in existence rather than having a beginning, and others are arguing for a plasma universe based around theories of electrical fields, etc. But what's interesting is that all these scientists have argued that the Big Bang Theory's monopoly on being the only theory in town and the only theory that attracts money and attracts research grants and attracts professorships and attracts or is published in journals is doing science a disservice. And I think this lack of open-mindedness in science is a problem throughout all of these, what I might call speculative branches of science, which is really not helpful at all. So I think when it comes to the cosmology, the study of the universe, it is wise to have an open mind about most things and not close things down. Now, when this particular article was published, an open letter, as it were, it was signed by maybe about 30 scientists, and it very quickly had 500 scientists signing up to it. So it does show there's a lot of scientists out there who are astronomers who do genuinely feel that the Big Bang Theory dominates in a way is not helpful or is justified by the level of information we have coming in. And there are a number of problems the Big Bang Theory faces, but I'm not going to look at those particularly. I just want to look at one interesting fact, and then I want to move on to some other more detailed things that I'll look at quickly. But the one interesting fact is this. Hubble discovered back in the 1920s and 30s that it looked to him that there was what's called a redshift in the galaxies that surrounded the Earth. And that looked like the galaxies were moving away from the Earth. That's what the redshift indicates. It doesn't have to be the case, and again, reserve judgment. There could be an alternative explanation for this. And so I'm not going to hang too much on this, but just let's run with the idea. Hubble's initial reaction to this was one of horror. John Hartnett explained this to me in a series of emails because I wanted to follow this up. Because what Paul realized was that if his findings were correct, it would suggest that the Earth was at the center of the universe or close to the center. It'd be a bit like if I threw a stone into a pond the ripples would go out from where the stone fell, and it would be really a person who were situated where the stone actually fell who would see that very consistent pattern of everything moving away like the ripples. And that's what we appear to see. Now, there's various devices to get around that, but the most obvious explanation is that actually maybe we are close to the center of the universe. And this would overturn that sort of what's called Copernican principle, that the Earth is not special, it's just an insignificant rock around an insignificant sun, around in an insignificant Milky Way. Maybe we are actually a significant planet with a significant sun in a significant Milky Way. This would probably make sense on the basis that God sent Jesus, his own son, to this Earth. And the biblical account certainly gives Earth a very key part to play. And so I think the idea that the Earth may be situated near the center does actually merit some careful attention. But I'm not saying that is the case. I'm just saying that's what the evidence seems to point to. What I want to look at now, and I shall use a little slideshow for this, is a series of items I have read over the years. And I've studied this for about 30 years, so I always take a keen interest in things that turn up. And I'm going to share this particular PowerPoint because I think it illustrates what I want to talk about. So just bear with me as I do this. And I'm getting a little bit more sure of myself as I do this. And hopefully the title comes up as Cosmology. Now, these are going to be a series of statements that are consistent with a young universe, but not consistent with an old universe. And this will allow us to build up a picture that I might say, a young universe seems to make more sense than an old universe. And if that's the case, then the issue that we started with, the starlight and time one, a bit like our radiometric dating, is something where we have to assume that the issue of starlight is not measuring time. It is measuring, I might say, a creational event where God created light. I've yet to come across a satisfactory explanation for the starlight and time problem, but just because we don't have a satisfactory explanation does not mean there isn't one. And so I'm prepared to put that to one side because I think the evidence for a young universe is pretty strong, as I hope to show. So the first piece of evidence is what's called the missing population 3 stars. And what this means is that if the universe was as old as we're told, which is 13 billion years old, or 13.5 billion years old, we should see star systems that have very little in the way of metals or trace elements of them. And this would be the indication of an aging star system. And we don't see those types of old star systems. What we tend to see consistently throughout the universe, no matter how far back in time we go, is the sort of star systems we see, if you might say, as fully formed galaxies with proper stars. There's no evidence of any young galaxies, nor any evidence of any old galaxies. It looks like we are seeing galaxies that are mature but not old, as if God created them. The next piece of evidence is there are too many blue stars. Blue stars are stars that shouldn't last very long. They should only last a few million years. Any evolutionary concept or Big Bang concept, such stars should be very rare, because if the universe is billions of years old, these stars should have long since died out. And yet again, we see evidence of lots of blue stars, which is consistent with a young universe, not what you expect to find if the universe was a very old, ancient universe. Another thing that we find is that in terms of the planets, they seem to have quite strong magnetic fields. In fact, Mr. Humphreys made his reputation, in one sense, in predicting the magnetic field for Neptune. It was either Uranus or Neptune. And he predicted that the magnetic field would be about 10 times greater than the magnetic field predicted by the NASA scientists. And the basis for his predictions was that he assumed that Neptune and Uranus were actually quite young planets, and therefore their magnetic fields had not decayed, but were still quite powerful. And there's some evidence to suggest that magnetic fields decay over time, and that's a real decay, it's not an oscillation. And Barry Setterfield did that work on the Earth's magnetic field. And I remember reading that about 35 years ago. It was one of the first articles I read on this subject. So the magnetic fields of the planets seem to be much stronger than you would expect if they were ancient. Comets. This shows you a typical comet with its dust tail, its iron tail, its nucleus, and heading towards the sun. Comets do not last very long. They burn up quite quickly. They get dragged into the sun or spun out to space. And therefore, they only have a short lifespan. Now, to overcome this, and to explain why we still have comets, there was the speculation of an Oort cloud that surrounded our solar system. There's no evidence that such an Oort cloud actually exists. It is a speculative invention. The most logical thing to say is that the existence of comets is because our solar system is only a young solar system. Therefore, these, you might say, features are there as one would expect in a young solar system. They wouldn't really be what you'd expect in an old solar system because comets don't last long. Spiral galaxies, very attractive to look at. We see them all over the universe. Now, those spirals that you see that are spiraling around, they, a bit like a ice skating dancer, should wind up quite quickly. Over 1,000 million years. But again, remember, if you're talking about 13 billion years or 10 billion years or 5 billion years, these spiral galaxies shouldn't exist. They should be no longer with their spirals. They should have been wound up. So the existence of spiral galaxies is, again, an anomaly that's consistent with a young universe, but not an old universe. I rather like this one. Type 3 supernova remnants have not been found. This is a picture of a supernova, an exploding star. Now, in that situation, what we do find are type 1, which are recently exploded stars, and type 2, that's exploded stars after a few thousand years. But type 3 are what we would expect to see if the stars had exploded 100,000 years ago, this sort of much more dispersed cloud system. And the literature at the time of the article that I read showed that no of these exploded star systems existed. But that was the case here, is we are finding that exploded star systems exist of type 1 and type 2, but not type 3. And so that's what we're looking at here. So, and the final particular thing I'm talking about is geological activity on the planets. And what we find here is volcanic activity on a lot of the planets, that the moons, particularly around the planets. And these moons are quite small bodies. And if they were, 3 or 4 billion years old, we would expect the geological activity to have ceased. But instead, we still see active planets, even with volcanoes erupting. And this is a picture of Triton on Neptune, one of its moons. But you will see this around the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. And so that's what we see here, is that there's plenty of evidence that we have got young moons, young planets, young solar system, young galaxies. And all that is, in a sense, consistent with a young creation, not consistent with an old universe. And so that finishes my talk on cosmology. When I come to my next talk, I want to consider how people have responded, the academic community, to all this information that I've been telling you about. What was the academic response to what seems to be overwhelming evidence for a recent creation and a worldwide flag. Thanks for listening.